Over the past week and more, we've had some really good positive feedback about our podcasts and encouragement for us to continue. So we shall continue for as long as we can manage anyhow. And we've also been asked why we have concentrated so much on Gaza. Well, there are actually two reasons. The first is that for the first time in human history, we are seeing in real time the unfolding of mass murder on an industrial scale. Genocide. That's a legal term, but it's now become used to describe that sort of thing. And it doesn't mean that other genocides are not being committed or that other horrors are not being perpetrated. But what, in such as Sudan, for example, in particular, no. But if nothing is being done, when we have our television screens, our cell phones, we can pick it all up, we can see it, we can see the murder that is going on. When we see that, and nothing can be done, when we see the impotence of someone like Antonio Guterres, probably a good man at the United Nations, but they can do nothing about it. If that happens, what chance does anyone else have? So that's one reason. The other one is because we're South Africans and we can see the link between what has happened in Israel and Palestine and what happened and the history, the very recent history that we went through in South Africa. And one of the main things here is the question of partition. Take, for example, here we have the 1947 United Nations idea of how they would deal with Palestine, Israel partition.
They recommend that Palestine be partitioned, a sovereign Jewish state to occupy this territory, here an Arab state to include Transjordania, and this strip, including the holy cities, to remain under British mandate.
Obviously, the largest part of land went to the minority of people who were classified as Jews. And the other side, Palestinians, referred to generally as Arabs, which is the biggest nonsense of all, because, of course, who is an Arab? An Arab is generally someone of slightly Mediterranean, darker complexion, whose home language or mother tongue is Arabic, someone from the Arabian Peninsula or North Africa. There are many Jews, Sephardi, who are Jews, and they're Arabs at the same time. So to use the term Arab and Jew is to weaponize that. And this is another term that was used by Zionists in order to drive a wedge. So we're used to that sort of wedge driving in South Africa, because look at the South African Bantustan policy.
I have just announced in Parliament details of the granting of self-government to the Transkei. The Transkei is the first Bantu homeland which has approached the government of the Republic to aid it by means of this great step on the road to independence.
I feel confident that the Bantu leadership of Africa, rural and urban, will, by the turn of next year, show in a most marked way that they are satisfied that this policy leads to their salvation.
William Bloke Modisani, formerly a journalist in Johannesburg and now earning a living as a writer in London. Mr. Modisani, from the time when Verwoerd was Minister of Native Affairs, what did his political career mean to you as a black South African?
Well, it meant just pure and simple, which are his phrases. It meant pure and simple that it's going to be tougher to be black in South Africa.
What was the worst feature of apartheid then?
It was when a man who is definitely very clever, like Dr. Verwoerd is very clever, a man who could give articulation to a system and even make it begin to sound like it has a rationale.
Our policy is one which is called by an Afrikaans word apartheid. And I'm afraid that has been misunderstood so often. It could just as easily, and perhaps much better, be described as a policy of good neighborliness.
It was when they were trying to seduce our rationale into an acceptance of apartheid that it really became bad. I think it is dangerous if you can make people or educate people into an acceptance of their own inferiority. They make you feel that you are not exactly human. You do not exactly belong. There's something wrong with you. And they actually get you to accept this.
Divide and rule. And of course, later on, and we won't go through the arguments about 1967 and what happened. The myth of the 1948 so-called mass attack on poor, innocent, and virtually defenseless Israel, completely untrue. We know that was a phony war. We've already shown that in our podcasts. But we knew there was the danger of division and partition. I'm old enough to have read about in my teens what happened with the partition of Pakistan and India into West and East Pakistan, and what went on there, which is now described as a genocide, legitimately as well, and became eventually Bangladesh. As a result of that, I personally have never, ever understood how the United Nations, until I began to realize that they're simply manipulated by the big powers, the big institutions such as the UN, could go for partition, to divide people when we are one humanity. So I have always stood for from the river to the sea, for a single secular state which respects all religions. And that is, in fact, where I would imagine the majority, certainly the majority of those people who were classified by the Jewish Board of Deputies as not real Jews, in fact, the anti-apartheid group, who were castigated by the Zionist Federation in South Africa in the 1950s and 60s when I was active. People who, like myself, we went to jail. Some of them went to jail for a long time, a very long time. Some were sentenced to life. People like Dennis Goldberg, for example, not a real Jew, really. But now, of course, the Zionist Federation hails people who were in the Rivonia trial or in 56 to 60, the treason trial. But not mentioned now, or not proudly mentioned, is the fact that Dr. Percy Utah was a member of the Jewish Board of Deputies. And he happened to be the prosecutor for the state who wanted the death penalty for Nelson Mandela and those not real Jews, such as Goldberg, etc., in the Rivonia trial. It is also known, for example, that Dr. Hendrik Verwoerd, beginning to panic that the whole apartheid thing was not beginning to work out, that economically, politically, there was a problem, that their allies were getting a bit squeamish about them. And he actually had a scheme to divide South Africa, rather than into these little fragments, into two fragments. KwaZulu-Natal as an integrated, as he called it, grouping. And this he worked with a man called Professor Blichnout in Pretoria, at the University of Pretoria, and his own Communicasie Navorsingskomitee, his Communication Research Committee, headed by Blichnout. But that never came to anything, obviously. But what you had was a division between the soft racists, for want of a better word, and the hard racists, the real fascists on the one side, and those who were fascist inclined but decided we better look after ourselves, a more intelligent group perhaps. And they were the ones who ultimately took over. In Israel, I feel, putting it very simply, and people may accuse us of simplicity, however, the hard line, the real fascists took over. Not that Netanyahu, Bibi, is a fascist necessarily. He's just a desperate man trying to keep out of prison, I think. However, without Ben-Gvir, without Smotrich, well, he wouldn't survive. And they are admitted fascists. So, therefore, what we see is the very virus that was implanted in all these areas by a decaying imperialism 100-odd years ago has begun to mutate. And one of those mutations has emerged as real fascism, which is authoritarian, militaristic, and brutal. And that is what happened. In South Africa, it went the other way. So therefore, we here, a lot of us in South Africa, feel a great affinity for what is happening to the Palestinian people. We have the same sorts of vicious, nasty, racist comments made in South Africa under the apartheid regime that we now have made. Like, for example, Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, referring to Palestinians as what? Listen to him.
אנחנו מטילים מצור מוחלט על העיר עזה. אין חשמל, אין מזון, אין מים, אין דלק. הכל סגור. אנחנו נלחמים בחיות אדם ואנחנו נוהגים בהתאם.
Human animals, yes, indeed. I wonder then how he would characterize these young people with their poyots and their kippah, their yarmulkes on, to try to proudly underline the fact that they're Jewish when what they were doing is perhaps totally anti any one of the 613 commandments of the Torah. These are savages. These are people who cannot be supported in any way. People who were trying to stop medical, food, and water aid to people who are thirsty and hungry and starving in Gaza. Why? Because they're Palestinians. But they make the excuse, well, of course, because look what they did to us on October the 7th. And that myth continues, much like the myth of 1948 and the so-called phony war. The myth of October the 7th, this was to be expected. What do you expect if you, for 17 years, blockade a people that you've already forced off their land into a tiny area, into what was described as Haaretz, the newspaper, described as the largest open-air prison in the world? Of course you're going to have a breakout. And when you have a breakout, it's well-organized, well-engineered by perhaps people who knew what they were doing, but in the process of doing it, they let loose, to quote Shakespeare's Mark Antony, the dogs of war, of angry young men who for years had been bottled up, who had known their families being ill-treated and humiliated. I mean, I know now myself when I think about it, and I think about how I felt as a young man in South Africa. When I came out of prison, and I was detained as well, and I was interrogated, not too gently, by the security forces, I know how I felt. I know I felt quite, well, deadly. I wanted to kill them. And I can understand that. What they're doing there in Israel and what the Zionists are doing is breeding the very thing which to give themselves strength again to say, they're against us. Yes, we're against Zionism. No one is going to fight a religious war, but that's what they're trying to do, while they themselves are anything but religious. As, for example, the Rabbi Yaakov Shapira notes.
Kill somebody that's around your age, steal his papers, steal his birth certificate, steal his license, steal his identity, and you're him. That's what the Zionists did to the Jews collectively. We're going to erase Jewish identity. We're going to take their history, change it a bit. We're going to take their identity. We're going to take their self-image. We're going to take Jewishness, and we're going to make it into Zionism, because they wanted to supply the Jews with national characteristics, national symptoms, national equipment. The hardest part was the country. They stole Jewish history. They revised all of Jewish history. They had this nonsense that Jews for thousands of years were looking for national self-determination, which is not true. We were looking for a messianic renewal of the world. They emptied Judaism of religious content, left the husk of whatever they could fit into their nationalism, and then they redid history, redid ideology, and just started creating cultural centers and schools and an entirely new, it was a social engineering project. But one thing they were unable to steal, and that's the definition of a Jew.
That virus of nationalism infects everything, everywhere. What we need now is to think clearly, to think cogently, and to understand the history. And above all, I believe, to accept that unless we begin to struggle for and to fight for one humanity on one planet, united in our diversity, we're in real trouble. And so is the entire planet.